Good morning. In the 21st chapter of John, John is talking, or Jesus is talking to Peter, and in the conversation, it's the last story in the gospel. Peter says, he notices a disciple Jesus loved following right behind. When Peter noticed him, he asked Jesus, "What's going on? What's going to happen to him?" Jesus said, "If I wanted him to live until I come again, what's that to you? You follow me." That is how the rumor got out among the brethren that this disciple wouldn't die. But that is not what Jesus said. He simply said, "If I wanted him to live until I come again, what's that to you?" This is the same disciple who was an eyewitness to all those things and wrote them down. And we all know that his eyewitness account is reliable and accurate. There are so many other things Jesus did. If they were all written down, each of them one by one, I can't imagine a world big enough to hold such a library of books. That's quite a story about this man that Jesus loved. And I'd like to spend a few moments thinking about this idea, the disciple who Jesus loved. I read a story recently about a prince who was born with a crooked back. He was all bent over, and he wanted to be straight. He's a very handsome man, but he was bent over with a crooked back. And his father, the king, decided to have a sculpture made of him. And the sculpture was made by the sculptor, and he was standing up straight. The prince was standing up straight. And he had this sculpture put in the prince's garden where he meditated and spent a lot of time. And each day when the prince would come, he would see the statue of a prince who was standing up straight. And he kept trying to stand straighter and straighter, and this went on for months and many years. And one day he stretched himself up, and when he stretched himself up like that, he popped up, and he had a straight back. And it happened to a great deal because there was this image that was out here in front of the prince with the crooked back. And by looking at the image, ultimately, according to this story, he got well. Now, I don't know about this story as to whether it's a real story or not, but there's a message underneath it, and it's the message that we have in this gospel story, the disciple who Jesus loved. It was over time that John recognized himself as the disciple who Jesus loved. Harry Emerson Fosdick, in one of his most famous sermons, begins it with a little line about a drifter who killed himself in New York Central Park. And there was nothing on the man that identified him other than this note. And the note said, "I'm a nobody. I don't matter to anything. I'm just a peanut in Yankee Stadium. And I'm going to squash that peanut." And so he took his life. Now that's a self-image that's really destructive. That you see yourself just as a peanut in the vast arena of Yankee Stadium. And there are a lot of people who have that kind of self-concept. In fact, it's our self-concept that has a lot to do with what we ultimately become. And somebody has said that how do we get our self-concept? How do we get it? Well, some people think very strongly that it happens during the very early months and years of our life. If we have people who affirm us and who see us as beautiful and tell us that we're worthy, we'll grow up worthy. But if we have a family or a dysfunctional group around us who sees us as dysfunctional and tells us that we're not very beautiful and that we don't matter, we'll grow up to be that kind of person. It depends on our self-concept. Now, if that were the truth about this story, then we would be in big trouble. But this story seems to imply that John had an experience with this man called Jesus, and that this experience made him see himself in a new light, and he described himself, whenever he described himself in the Gospels, he only did it in the Gospel, he described himself 4 times. And he always said, the disciple who Jesus loved. Somehow that had got a hold of him. That had gone down in deep inside him. Tradition tells us that John didn't grow up in a very wonderful family. His father was Zebedee, and he was a very rich and successful fisherman. He had offices in Jerusalem, and he was out in Galilee, and his sons were there with him. And he had two sons. He had John, and he had James. And James was a man who was very boisterous and had a quick temper. And of course, if you understand anything about that sibling relationship, you know that there had to be a lot of conflict. Now, John seems to be much more of a laid-back kind of person. And so, of course, his brother might well run roughshod over him. And he would have a concept of himself that was not very good. Now, even his mother was a problem. When she comes to Jesus and she says to Jesus, hey, when you set up your kingdom, I want my two boys, one to sit on your right hand and one on your left hand. That's a pretty blatant kind of an approach. And that's the kind of mother he had. He had a father who created issues for him. He had a brother who probably created problems for him. And a mother who was never satisfied with what he was. And so he grew up with that kind of an experience. And one day he met Jesus. And when he met Jesus, something wonderful happened. Jesus didn't condemn him. He just said, hey, I want to be your friend. Come and follow me. And so what did happen is John stepped up and he started following Jesus. And when he got with Jesus, Jesus didn't say, hey, you got to do this, you got to learn that. He just said, hey, stick around. Well, I like you, and I just want to be a part of your life. And so John stuck around. And over time he got to know Jesus, and Jesus began to talk to him about the future and about what life could be. And all of a sudden John got a new concept of himself. He saw himself as the disciple who Jesus loved. That's a majestic story, a majestic idea that because he spends time with Jesus, he was able to see himself in a new light, and he saw himself as the disciple who Jesus loved. Now the tradition tells us that there are at least 5 books in the New Testament that were either written by John or written by some of his followers. And all of these books talk about the love of God and the love of Jesus and how this works in our lives. And it occurred because John had an encounter with Jesus, and he walked with Jesus, and it wasn't long before he discovered that Jesus didn't want him to do anything. He just wanted him to know him. He just wanted to love him. He just wanted to embrace him. Now that could well be the story for us. I read about a town way out somewhere that had on the side of the mountain there was a face. It was called the stone face. And somehow nature had carved this face in the stone. And the legend was that someday there would come a man and he would have that kind of face. And he would look like that picture. And when he came, wonderful things would happen. Well, there was a boy in that town by the name of Ernest. And Ernest always looked at that face on the side of the mountain. And he told his mom how much he'd like to get to know that man. He hoped he'd be here when that man showed up. And he kept watching that man. And years went by, and a poet came through the community, and the poet was there, and he recognized that this man Ernest had grown in the affection of all the people there, and they all loved him. And as he looked at Ernest, he looked at the picture or the face on the side of the mountain, and he recognized, and he said, hey, that Ernest is that face. And the reason he became that face was because day after day he visioned that face, and that face became a part of it. And that's the story for each of us. If we can come to Jesus, we'll discover that we are disciples who he loves. And when we discover that we're loved, we'll be able to live a life that's much more fulfilling and hopeful and able to do things for the world. I'm praying that the good Lord will do that for you, that you'll get the message that he wants to say to you this morning, which is, you're the disciple who Jesus loves.